I am glad to be able to speak to you guys a little bit about some of my research. And what I'm really focusing on with this talk is trying to project some of the problems that are of interest to me moving forward. And there's been a lot of talk recently about hypersonics and different ground test facilities and you know, really trying to advance some of the state of the art, whether it's high-speed vehicles, launch vehicles. And so what we're really interested in is these novel image-based diagnostics. When I say image-based diagnostics, I mean using a camera and image sensor of some type to do measurements in these facilities. And a big theme for us is we've done a lot of novel measurements that have worked well at a laboratory scale, like at Auburn in one of our labs and one of our wind tunnels. But the real challenge, the real transition, what we're trying to maneuver and aim our program at is how do we translate some of these unique capabilities that we can use at the academic lab and make them applicable to a ground test facility that's large, expensive to run, has a lot of its own challenges, or even to flight test. And so that's sort of the picture I'm going to try to paint today. We've had a lot of sponsors and partners over the years with the Department of Defense, federal industry, and you can see them listed there. And we've also developed a lot of techniques. And so what has been the sort of bread and butter for the lab has been this, what we call light field imaging with plenoptic cameras. And I'll show a little bit about how a plenoptic camera works, and then I'll talk about how we're sort of trying to push those boundaries. But the basic idea of a plenoptic camera is you take a conventional camera, but we package it with a small microlens array. And so in this, let me turn the laser pointer on here. You can see this, we basically take a conventional camera and then we repackage it with a microlens to sit in front of the image sensor. And the function of that microlens is to take all the angular information that that camera is collecting and to discretize it and allow us to measure the different angular information. The advantage of that type of system is that you can do 3D imaging with a single camera, which means we can go into some of these facilities where there's limited optical access and still get the advantages you might get with more multi-camera systems. And it's a snapshot. It's a fast technique. So here's just a picture of how we manufacture these cameras in a clean room. I wish it went this fast. It's a much more tedious, stressful process. But we've learned basically how to modify these things. And like I said, what we do is we interject here and we put this microlens array. So when you take an image like this shows playing cards, and you zoom in, you see each of these little circles. Each circle is that microlens. So each microlens covers about a 16 by 16 pixel region. Each microlens is just a different position. That's why if I look at this deck of cards, I can see the king of clubs, because every microlens is looking at a different position. But if I look at the individual microlens, we see a variation of the image because each pixel represents a different direction that microlens is seeing. So when you take an information, again, this is like a snapshot, you know, click, you get all this information. We can then sort through this on a computer afterwards and extract what the world looks like through different perspectives from the camera, or we can change the focal plane. So you can shift the perspective. So we see this on the right here. Play this movie again. You can refocus this image back and forth, and you can see, oh, that's a queen sitting behind the king, whereas normally you'd be restricted to whatever that focus was. So we were inspired by that, you know, maybe 10 years ago, realizing, hey, if there's a camera that can do this, we can do something from a fluid dynamics perspective. And the obvious thing to us was to look at particles or fragments, anything that is in the flow that you can sort of see with your eye or illuminate with a light of some sort, then we can do a 3D sort of triangulation. So this is actually something Elise was able to help with um, at Sandia National Labs with the camera that they have there. And this is just a blasting cap. And the idea is to give you an idea for the dynamics of this situation, where this is a high speed, in this case, catastrophic event. Sandia National Labs has a lot of interest in sort of understanding the behavior of these types of events. Here's a video of this blasting cap, and you can see it's a high-speed video. And so if you take a snapshot in time, like right around there, and you want to see what's happening with our camera, you can get a very good sense. And basically, Elise was able to write an algorithm that identified all of these particles and determined both their size, their shape, and their 3D position in space, which ends up being a very useful tool in a lot of other situations. The other thing you can do, and we saw a lot of wind tunnel and water tunnel measurements that were shown before, is if you put small particles into that wind tunnel, you can track where those particles are and get a three-dimensional image of what the flow field is. And that's what we see here. This is a simple hemisphere. It's similar to Dr. Ahmed's turret that he talked about before. And you can see this vortex being shed off the back of the hemisphere. This was done in water, a relatively simple experiment. You contrast that to this experiment on the right. This is a fin. It's at a 15-degree angle, but it's in a Mach 2 flow field. So when this Mach 2 flow hits this fin, it creates a shock wave here, this red surface, at a 45-degree angle, in this case, an oblique shock. But when you look at that shock as it approaches the floor, so if you picture a control fin on the side is the side of a missile or a rocket, there's a shock boundary layer interaction. And in this boundary layer region, you get a very three-dimensional effect of what the flow field is doing. So this technique allows us to do, basically take a technique that we applied in a water tunnel, move to a wind tunnel where optical access could be challenging, and get three-dimensional information from that. So those are things we've done over the last 5 to 10 years. What we focused on more recently is how do we use this extra information that we have in the camera to do something a little bit more. And so one of the things an idea that we had was, if you take this camera where, again, I have a point, this lens collects all that light, and then it's going to focus it back onto my microlens array. If you put some sort of color filter in there, you can basically now encode color onto the image. Now you might be thinking, oh, big deal, we have color cameras, we've been doing color imaging for years. The advantage here is that we can manually select the exact wavelengths that we want. So with a conventional color camera, like on your phone with that Bayer pattern, that red, green, blue, you are limited to whatever the camera manufacturer made those red, green, blue wavelengths are. They're typically broad and they typically overlap. That makes it very difficult to use that information for any sort of custom scientific measurement. And if you wanted to customize a sensor like that, you're talking about millions of dollars to come up with that one custom sensor. So the advantage here is we can put in very distinct color filters here, and we can measure not just 3 colors, we can measure 15 colors. In theory, you can measure hundreds of colors. So what we've developed is some techniques to, one, look at strand burners. So this is from a propulsion point of view, looking at plume diagnostics. If we basically, in this case, we added aluminum to the solid fuel propellant, and you get this, and you can see we are able to measure particles in this plume up to a couple thousand degrees. So there's a lot of military applications where you really care about the exhaust of the plume. On a re-entry point of view with thermal protection systems, we can measure temperatures. If you heat something to thousands of degrees and it's glowing red hot, that color reveals a lot about what the temperature is. But the reality is most materials don't behave like a simple black body, and so that idea that you just have an infrared camera and you can measure how the temperature of something that only works for idealized cases. So when we use a camera like this, where we're measuring several wavelengths at once, we can actually determine the temperature based on that wavelength information. The reason I like this copper melting pool example is copper has the unique property, and a lot of metals do, is that in the liquid state, the emissivity actually drops. So that if I had the solid state and the liquid state at the same temperature, like at the phase transition, the solid form of the material is about 4 to 5 times brighter than the liquid form. But with our approach, we're able to get the temperatures through that phase transition and distinguish the solid and the liquids and get temperature. So if you're thinking of a heat shield, a thermal protection system, which a lot of the hypersonic challenges is a materials-based challenge, and a lot of those tests that they're doing in these high-speed facilities is different material types, different configurations. We now have a sensor that can potentially extract these 2D temperature maps of the surface in real time with a pretty simple camera, which means we can go to different facilities and do different things. And then the last idea I just want to talk about, which is the most recent one that we've been working on with the Air Force Research Labs, is to take cameras like on your cell phone, which we've all gotten used to pulling something out of our pocket and snapping a photo of whatever we want. And we basically asked ourselves the question, why can't we use that technology in these facilities, in these wind tunnels, to do the measurements that we're used to? We're so used to using cameras that cost tens of thousands of dollars to do measurements that, and they're fairly large, and for good reason. There's a lot that goes into them, but can we distill down to the fundamental pieces of what we need to do a measurement with off-the-shelf miniature camera components? And so we're working with the Air Force to start to do that. We're at the end of our first year. Hopefully I'll get some data cleared that I can share with you, but the idea is we are building these cameras into models so that we can now look at internal flows, inside inlets, inside combustors. And so we have a game plan laid out where we're going to take these cameras and package them so that when you go into these large ground test facilities with these decent sized models, the instrumentation, when they instrument those models, can include image-based diagnostics. And that should open up a whole new regime of measurements that we're able to extract from each of these tests. And each of these tests are very expensive. So the more data you can get from every test, the better off we are. And last but not least, we've also been developing some Schlieren-based imaging techniques, which are very useful. And it's that similar idea. Can I change my viewpoint? Can I do some sort of three-dimensionality? And the bottom line is absolutely. You can, on the upper right here, we're actually showing a focusing Schlieren technique. So again, we can take an image. In this case, it's sort of like a 2 cones in this tunnel. This one is a little bit closer than the one behind it. And as you refocus, you can see shocks coming in and out of focus. So you can take a traditional Schlieren-based technique and add a layer of depth or three-dimensionality to it. And if you're able to use multiple cameras, we can do full 3D reconstructions of whatever we're looking at. Again, we start with simple laboratory scale type stuff, Bunsen burners, but the idea is to learn how to do it here and then advance that into these more complicated facilities. So I'm going to end with this slide because it just sort of summarizes some of the directions I'd like to head with my lab, some of the connections I'm hoping to make through this type of forum. You know, we specialize in these diagnostics. There's a lot of potential. And what we're really trying to do is translate these things to ground test facilities and flight test. And, you know, what the last thought I'll say with a lot of faculty are motivated, and as we sort of talk to different industry types, the workforce development piece is very important to us. That's why we're at a university. We love working with students. We love training students, and any connections we can make with potential employers, laboratories, industry, and sort of do 2 birds with 1 stone type of approaches where we're able to train our students to be of relevance to you, those are things we love to hear about and would love to be involved with. So that is the end of my time. And I thank everybody for hanging in there and listening. And I have a couple minutes for questions if anybody would like to ask something, and otherwise we'll end the day.
No questions. I would just comment. The whole thing was really great, very interesting, and it's just inspiring, actually. So thanks.
Well, thanks for being there from the beginning. It was great to see you there and asking questions and engaged, and it was our pleasure for sure.
Hey, Brian, Gene Fuller. Where is the experimental measurement techniques relative to computational techniques? In other words, are the experimental techniques keeping up with the ability of computational techniques to kind of verify, what's going on there?
I will give you a different answer than Nick would. But honestly, I think the next piece of this is the fusion of experimental techniques with computational methods. So the idea that you could take some of the data that we're collecting to inform a computational method that can fill in all the missing details and gaps so that you can get the same level of fidelity as a high, some of the movies that Nick showed were incredibly detailed. We're not ready to get to that level of detail with an experiment, but it also takes him a long time to create that detail. So if there's a way we can take a limited amount of experimental data to feed into a computational model, then the model can fill in a lot of those gaps, and potentially that model can be used to extrapolate to new geometries and new flow regimes. So I think it's sort of a back and forth between experiments and computations. But I will say on the hypersonic side, they're building some new hypersonic facilities that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. They wouldn't be building those facilities if the computations were entirely there to model everything that's going on.
Yeah, I have a second question. Your optical techniques, do they have any application for planetary exploration, like the mission to Mars right now? Can any of those techniques be applied to help get additional information out of the exploration on the planet, etc.?
I think there's some potential long term. Most of the technology that ends up on a interplanetary mission is 20 years old by the time it gets to its location. It's a very stringent process to take anything from the Earth and get it into space. So I would love to work on something like that, and so there is some potential, but let's just wait and see what happens.
Okay.
Brian, I had one quick question. I'm not even sure I know how to ask it, but in terms of these small cameras you were talking about, I know you're talking about research, but from an operational standpoint, could they be integrated into some type of a feedback control system for flight controls, fly-by-wire type systems?
Not the planoptic camera work that I showed. I think there's a little bit too much computations that goes on behind the scenes. But some of the smaller multi-camera stuff, there are enough resources out there to do real-time sort of vision-based, and there are systems out there that are vision-based sort of, what's the word for it? Navigation.
Yeah, I guess I was saying other than, maybe traditional pressure transducers or temperature transducers, you use some type of an optical system to get your feedback.
It's definitely trending in that direction for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, thanks for a great day. Very, very impressive.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and close the session, but I'm going to hang out here on Zoom for anybody that has any questions or just about the department or anything.